I would like to explore the subject of paranoia. As a therapist, I worked with a lot of people who had strains of paranoia, sometimes extreme paranoia. And sometimes they even had paranoia against me. Certainly they had paranoia against mental health professionals in general, not infrequently. Well, what I came to in studying paranoia is that actually it has a root of healthiness. There's a reason it really is there fundamentally. And what I saw again and again is that people who are paranoid, people who have this irrational fear that others are out to get them, actually at one time in their life, or maybe for long periods of their life, actually did have people that were out to get them, did have people often who were conspiring to harm them in certain ways, or actually were harming them in certain ways. And often this goes right back to people's earliest childhood, right back to their earliest family of origin, often in their relationship with their parents. They were being harmed when they were very, very little, very, very young, in some sort of way, all sorts of different ways, physically abused, maybe sexually abused, emotionally, psychologically manipulated, children who witnessed horrible things, who were constantly or often being abandoned. These are the kind of things that can create terror in a child and make a child, sometimes even a baby, not trust the world around him or her. Basically, what this does is this sets the stage for the child having lots and lots of fear. And as the child grows up, it's very easy to transfer this fear outward to others, to displace this fear onto the outside world. Sometimes when the outside world maybe doesn't deserve it at all, or deserves it much, much less than the child's early family of origin, or whoever it was early on that was really doing harmful things to the child. Another thing that I've seen, not infrequently, when people are really paranoid, that they actually have no knowledge of the core place, the root place that their paranoia is coming from, such that actually by transferring their terror, their fear outward to people who don't necessarily even deserve it, they're actually protecting their original abusers. That is, what I've seen is sometimes people who are really paranoid can come from horrible families of origin, horribly abusive background situations, and yet they don't see it that way. And they can say, oh, my mother was so great, my father was so great, oh, they had a hard life in this way or that way, but they really loved me. Whereas the evidence, sometimes I've seen, gathered over time, heard from other family members, sometimes even witnessed when I've watched people grow up, is that that's not actually what happened at all. And by being paranoid with the outside world, it really can protect their abusers. And why would someone want to protect their abusers? Well, a main reason that I see people often really want to protect their abusers, especially when their abusers are their parents, is they needed to get love from their parents. And if they actually felt their feelings, if they were connected to their feelings, if they were not dissociated from their reactions to being traumatized by their primary love objects, by their parents would love them even less. So basically dissociating, pushing their feelings down, pushing their terror down, and then ultimately transferring it outward to the world, to some other group who supposedly is after them, actually can ensure that their parents continue to love them in some ways. Also, what it can do by putting the fear outward and not actually feeling it directly for the people who did it, is it can actually protect the people from feeling a lot of pain. Because going back and feeling pain from very early childhood, really feeling the post-traumatic reactions that people had and still hold inside, is horrible. It's atrocious. It can be overwhelming. It can even lead people to have breakdowns. So sometimes actually being paranoid is more comfortable, feels easier, makes life more soothing in a way. It's not as overwhelming. So even though in a way it can make life dysfunctional, it can make it hard to work, it can make it hard to have friendships, it can make it hard to have romantic relationships, all those negative things actually still can be less painful than feeling that early core childhood pain. But then there are some caveats. One interesting caveat that I saw, not infrequently in the mental health field, is that clients of mine had a lot of so-called paranoia around mental health professionals. They had paranoia around psychiatrists. They had paranoia around mental hospitals. They had paranoia around therapists. And why I say so-called paranoia is because that's what I read in their chart, or that's what their former therapist told me when they were transferring this client to me. Oh, just be careful. This person is so paranoid against therapists. They're paranoid against psychiatrists. They're paranoid against the medications. They think we are trying to poison them with their medications. And then I'd think, how interesting. Actually, I think to some degree, these people are very logical in their fears, especially when I worked with these people over time, and I heard the horrible things that mental health professionals sometimes did to them. I heard the horrible reactions that they had to their psychiatric medications, force injected with Haldol and antipsychotic while they were being strapped down because they were having different emotional problems, or they couldn't sleep, or they were angry, or they refused medication. And then you wonder, wait a second, what is it like for them to have gone through that experience? A lot of times the mental health professionals never asked what it felt like for these people to go through that experience. Or if the person overtly shared it, listen, the medications made me feel horrible, or the antipsychotics had horrible reactions in me, produced horrible side effects, gave me akathisia, gave me dystonia, things like this, and made me feel rotten, and made me feel like I just wanted to die, or made me feel like I was already dead inside. What they said is the mental health professionals didn't want to listen. Oh, you're just being paranoid. We're out to help you. We're here for your own good. So what I realized sometimes, and these were sometimes even clients that I worked with who definitely did have streaks of paranoia in their personality. And yet, just because they had streaks of paranoia in their personality didn't mean that sometimes they weren't actually totally correct in having fears of certain people, in saying this group of people, these doctors, these psychiatrists, this mental hospital is actually conspiring against me. And also, I got that from working in the mental health field. I sat in on team meetings for the short time that I worked at a psychiatric hospital. Also, the same thing happened when I worked at some mental health clinics, and we would discuss patients. The patients often knew they were being discussed. They were being picked apart publicly. And in a way, it's kind of like the clinicians, these team meetings, were kind of conspiring often against the patients. A lot of the treatments that they came up with, so-called treatments, actually were not helpful to people, and sometimes went very much against what I considered to be real healing processes. Also, sometimes what I saw, not infrequently, is that mental health professionals and psychiatrists, especially psychiatrists often, were very much siding with these troubled patients' parents. They looked at these people's parents as their greatest allies. Oh, this person has a supportive family. It didn't mean that the parents were actually supportive of this person on an emotional level. What it meant that often these parents were supportive of the psychiatrists, supportive of the mental health professionals. They formed an alliance with the mental health professionals, often to force medicate clients more, to keep them in the hospital, to require them to get certain treatments, to force them to accept certain diagnoses, to do things that these people didn't really want to do. At some level, things that intuitively they knew were not in their best interests. So actually, sometimes there really were conspiracies against clients. I heard this again and again. And when I would hear clients say, yeah, they're all conspiring against me, it would be like, well, yeah, actually they are. And sometimes I would directly say it. However, that doesn't mean that all paranoia that people have is actually correct or accurate. And sometimes this is a very hard thing in the position of a therapist, when I was a therapist, to help someone sort out, because sometimes what I saw is people just wanted to believe that all their paranoia was true, and sometimes it was really comfortable. Also, sometimes when I would challenge people and say, you know, I think you think these people are conspiring against you, this group of people, your coworkers, etc., but I don't think you are actually accurate. And sometimes people would then say, well, if I'm not accurate, are you saying that I'm crazy? And that would be terrifying for them. They don't want to consider themselves crazy. And I'd say, well, I don't know, let's just get away from this word crazy. I'd say let's instead look at the root of the traumas in your life, because often that's what I found. If there was going to be any root cure for somebody's paranoia, it was not going to be arguing with them about the surface back and forth about whether other people were conspiring against them or not, because sometimes people weren't really open to that. Sometimes they were. I had cases where I could actually argue someone to some degree out of some degree of paranoia with someone that they had in their life or some group they had in their life. But what I saw is the larger cure, the greater cure, was to go into the childhood, to go into the childhood history of trauma, to really bring up those ancient feelings and to begin to grieve them. And when people really began to grieve their traumas, really grieve what happened to them historically, their paranoia would begin to dry up at the roots. The plant that was paranoia would begin to wither and die. Now, as I close this, what I would like to also say is that I'm not immune from having had paranoia in my life as well. I've had a few times in my life where I did become paranoid. I had fears that outside people, sometimes people I didn't even know, or people that weren't necessarily even out there, were trying to get me. I felt in danger. I felt threatened. And I felt like, sometimes I was even kind of aware that I was paranoid, but at the same time, the terror was still there. And what I found is, yes, this was connected to my early history of childhood trauma, but it also came up for me. This paranoia erupted in times when I was more socially isolated and also under a lot more stress, under a lot more internal pressure, a lot of internal confusion, pain, existential crisis. So for me, another thing that really helped me work out whatever history of paranoia I had, work out the paranoia at its root, was not just resolving or making great steps toward resolving my childhood trauma, but also living a healthier lifestyle, being around healthier people in my life, having more healthy social interaction, finding friends, finding people who I really could trust, who loved me, people who I actually was really convinced loved me. Basically regaining my fabric of trust with humanity.